the Cilician pirate confederacy. In 67 BCE, reports began flooding into the Roman Senate from every corner of the Mediterranean. Grain ships bound for Rome vanished without trace. Merchant convoys were found adrift, their crews missing, their cargo holds stripped bare. Along the southern coast of Anatolia, Roman patrol vessels reported sightings of sleek warships emerging from hidden coves at dawn, striking with surgical precision before disappearing into the rugged cliffs of Cilicia. The crisis escalated when a young Roman noble, Gaius Julius Caesar, was abducted by pirates while sailing near the island of Pharmacusa. According to later accounts, Caesar was held for ransom in a fortified coastal enclave, treated not as a prisoner, but as a hostage of political value. He reportedly laughed at the sum demanded for his release, insisting they raise it, as though acknowledging their authority. The incident was dismissed publicly as a humiliation. Privately, it revealed a disturbing truth. The Mediterranean, the lifeline of Rome, was no longer under Roman control. The Cilician pirates were not a scattered band of marauders. They operated as a confederacy, a decentralized but coordinated network of strongholds carved into the jagged coastline of southern Anatolia. Their fleets, numbering in the hundreds, consisted of swift biremes and triremes engineered for speed and maneuverability. Archaeological surveys of ancient harbors along the Taurus Mountains reveal fortified anchorages concealed within narrow inlets, protected by natural rock formations and watchtowers. These bases functioned as logistical hubs where plundered cargo was cataloged, redistributed, and sold across clandestine markets. Roman grain shipments from Egypt, essential to feeding over 1 million citizens in the capital, were routinely intercepted. The pirates controlled not merely the seas, but the economy itself. Ancient historians recorded that entire coastal cities fell under their influence. Ports in Crete, Cyprus, and parts of Greece provided refuge and trade opportunities, either through coercion or collaboration. Captives were sold into slavery, nobles were ransomed, and sacred temples were looted. Inscriptions recovered from Delos and Rhodes reference disruptions to maritime trade during this period, while Roman records describe a dramatic surge in grain prices and civil unrest in the capital. The pirates' operations extended far beyond robbery. They imposed tribute, regulated passage through strategic waters, and dictated the flow of commerce across the Mediterranean. To merchants and sailors, their authority was as tangible as that of any empire. The Roman response was swift but desperate. In 67 BCE, the Senate granted extraordinary powers to General Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, under the Lex Gabinia. He was given command over the entire Mediterranean and its coastal territories for 50 miles inland, an unprecedented concentration of authority. Within months, Pompey deployed a vast naval force, systematically sweeping pirate strongholds and dismantling their confederacy. Contemporary accounts claim that more than 1,000 pirate ships were destroyed or captured, and tens of thousands of prisoners were resettled inland to prevent their return to the sea. Officially, the threat was eradicated in less than a year. Unofficially, the speed of the campaign raised questions. How had such a vast network risen undetected, and why had it been tolerated for so long? Upon the conclusion of the campaign, records of the pirates' internal organization became increasingly scarce. Many of their former strongholds were abandoned or repurposed, and surviving captains vanished from historical accounts. Roman propaganda celebrated Pompey's victory as a triumph of order over chaos, yet references to pirate-controlled trade routes persisted in scattered maritime records. Some historians suggest that elements of the Confederacy were quietly absorbed into regional economies under Roman supervision. Others speculate that their influence extended deeper into Mediterranean commerce than official narratives admit. If the Cilician Confederacy truly controlled the lifeblood of Rome, its grain supply, trade routes, and coastal cities, then their power rivaled that of the Republic itself. They were not merely thieves operating in the shadows. They were architects of an alternative order upon the sea, enforcing their own laws, collecting tribute, and commanding allegiance through fear and necessity. The Mediterranean eventually returned to Roman dominion, but for a brief and unsettling moment in history, the empire's greatest sea became a realm governed not by senators or emperors, but by men history chose to call pirates. The Xiongnu warlord Modu Chanyu, in 209 BCE, Amid the windswept grasslands north of the Great Wall, a signal arrow pierced the sky. Fired from the bow of a young nomadic prince named Modu, it was not intended as a weapon, but as a test of loyalty. According to ancient chronicles, Modu ordered his warriors to shoot whatever his arrow struck. When he aimed at his prized horse, they obeyed. When he targeted his favorite wife, they hesitated, and were executed. Finally, he loosed the arrow toward his own father, Chanyu, ruler of the Xiongnu. This time, every rider released their arrows without hesitation. The old chieftain fell beneath a storm of iron. In that moment, Modu seized control of the Xiongnu Confederation, transforming a fractured band of raiders into a formidable empire of the steppes. What followed was not merely a succession. It was the birth of a power that would terrify imperial China for centuries. The Xiongnu were masters of the open plains, their lives defined by mobility, discipline, and survival. Mounted on hardy steppe horses capable of traveling vast distances without rest, their warriors wielded composite bows crafted from horn, wood, and sinew, deadly weapons capable of piercing armor from over 500 feet away. Chinese military records describe their tactics as elusive and relentless. They advanced without warning, striking settlements, seizing livestock, and vanishing into the horizon before imperial armies could respond. Entire frontier towns were abandoned as waves of Xiongnu cavalry swept across the northern borders, disrupting agriculture and crippling trade routes that connected the heart of China to Central Asia. Under Modu Chanyu's rule, the Xiongnu evolved beyond mere raiders. He forged alliances with neighboring tribes, unified them under a strict military hierarchy, and instituted a system of tribute and diplomacy that rivaled the political sophistication of the Han dynasty. Archaeological discoveries in Mongolia and Inner Asia reveal elaborate burial mounds containing gold ornaments, lacquerware, and silk textiles, evidence of both wealth and cultural exchange. Chinese envoys recorded that the Xiongnu demanded silk, grain, and princesses from the Han court as part of peace agreements known as heikin. These treaties, often framed as diplomatic marriages, were in reality acknowledgments of Xiongnu dominance over the northern frontier. The threat posed by Modu's confederation forced the Han dynasty into defensive measures of unprecedented scale. Sections of earlier fortifications were expanded and reinforced, forming what would later be known as the Great Wall of China. Imperial armies were dispatched northward in costly campaigns, yet victory proved elusive. The Xiongnu's mastery of guerrilla warfare allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement, striking swiftly and retreating into the vastness of the steppe. Han historians describe them not as mere bandits, but as an empire equal in power, commanding territories that stretched from Manchuria to the Altai Mountains. Their influence extended deep into the Silk Road, controlling trade between East and West and shaping the economic landscape of Eurasia. Despite their prominence, the historical record surrounding the Xiongnu remains fragmentary and enigmatic. Much of what is known derives from Chinese chronicles such as the Shiji and the Hanshu, texts composed by imperial historians whose perspectives were shaped by conflict and rivalry. Few written records survive from the Xiongnu themselves, leaving their language, origins, and internal governance shrouded in uncertainty. Archaeological findings continue to challenge long-held assumptions, suggesting a complex society with diplomatic networks, artistic traditions, and technological innovations previously unrecognized by mainstream scholarship. Over time, the Xiongnu Confederation fragmented under internal pressures and sustained military campaigns by the Han dynasty. By the 1st century CE, their power waned, and many tribes migrated westward, possibly contributing to the movements of nomadic peoples that later reshaped Europe. Yet, their legacy endured. The Great Wall stands as a silent testament to their influence, a monumental barrier erected not against an empire recognized by history, but against a confederation often dismissed as marauders. If Modu Chanyu and his horse archers could compel one of the world's greatest empires to pay tribute, construct vast fortifications, and reshape its foreign policy, then the distinction between bandit and sovereign becomes blurred beyond recognition. To the Han dynasty, they were raiders from the steppe. To their own people, they were rulers of an empire without walls. The Scythian Raider Kings. In 513 BCE, the armies of the Persian Empire marched northward under the command of King Darius I, determined to subdue the elusive Scythians who roamed the vast Eurasian steppe. The campaign began with confidence. Persian forces crossed the Bosporus on a pontoon bridge and advanced deep into the northern plains, expecting a decisive confrontation. Instead, they encountered silence. Villages lay abandoned, wells were poisoned, and the horizon stretched empty in every direction. Days turned into weeks as the invaders pursued an enemy that refused to stand and fight. Supplies dwindled, morale faltered, and confusion spread among the ranks. According to Herodotus, a single message eventually reached Darius, a cryptic gift from the Scythian kings: a bird, a mouse, a frog, and 5 arrows. Interpreted as a warning, it signified that unless the Persians could fly like birds, burrow like mice, or hide in the marshes like frogs, they would perish beneath Scythian arrows. The campaign ended in failure. The empire had faced not an army, but a civilization that turned the land itself into a weapon. The Scythians were masters of the steppe, nomadic warriors whose lives revolved around mobility and survival. Mounted on swift horses bred for endurance, they carried composite bows capable of striking targets with lethal precision from distances exceeding 500 feet. Their tactics, later known as mounted guerrilla warfare, allowed them to strike suddenly and disappear into the vast grasslands before their enemies could respond. Greek historians describe them as ghost-like riders who could fire arrows in retreat with uncanny accuracy, a maneuver later termed the Parthian shot. To settled civilizations, they were unpredictable and untouchable, controlling the trade routes that connected Europe, Central Asia, and the Near East. Archaeological discoveries across the Eurasian steppe have revealed the true scale of Scythian power. Burial mounds known as kurgans, scattered from Ukraine to Siberia, contain elaborate grave goods, gold ornaments, finely crafted weapons, and textiles preserved in permafrost. The frozen tombs of Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains uncovered richly decorated saddles, intricately woven carpets, and the tattooed remains of Scythian nobility, evidence of a sophisticated culture concealed beneath their reputation as raiders. These findings suggest a hierarchical society ruled by warrior elites who commanded vast territories and controlled the movement of goods along early trade corridors that would later form part of the Silk Road. The Scythian kings did not merely raid, they dictated the flow of commerce across the steppe. Greek colonies along the Black Sea, including Olbia and Pantikapayan, relied on Scythian protection to maintain trade in grain, livestock, and precious metals. In return, tribute flowed northward, reinforcing Scythian authority over the region. Their influence extended so far that even the Persian Empire, at the height of its power, failed to subjugate them. By refusing conventional warfare, the Scythians demonstrated a strategic sophistication that challenged the military doctrines of the ancient world. Despite their dominance, the Scythians left no written records of their own, and much of what is known about them comes from Greek historians whose accounts blend admiration with fear. Over time, their presence faded from the historical stage, replaced by successive nomadic confederations that inherited their tactics and territories. Yet their legacy endured in the military strategies of later steppe empires, from the Sarmatians to the Mongols, whose mounted archers would reshape the course of Eurasian history centuries later. Modern excavations continue to uncover Scythian artifacts of extraordinary craftsmanship, prompting scholars to reassess their place in antiquity. Far from being mere marauders, they were architects of a transcontinental network that connected distant civilizations through trade, warfare, and diplomacy. Their dominance over the steppe created a balance of power that neither Persia nor Greece could easily disrupt. The land itself served as their fortress, and mobility was their greatest weapon. If the Scythian kings could defy the might of Darius I, dictate the movement of commerce, and command allegiance across thousands of miles without building cities or fortifications, then their authority transcended the label of banditry. They were rulers of an empire without walls, sovereigns of the open horizon, whose dominion existed not in stone, but in motion. The Nabataean desert lords. In the 3rd century BCE, caravans traveling across the Arabian desert began disappearing without explanation. Laden with frankincense, myrrh, spices, and precious textiles destined for the markets of the Mediterranean, these caravans were the lifeblood of ancient commerce. Yet, somewhere between the incense groves of southern Arabia and the ports of Gaza and Alexandria, entire convoys vanished into the sands. Survivors spoke in hushed tones of shadowy riders emerging from rocky canyons at dusk, striking with precision before fading back into the desert. Greek and Roman sources referred to these figures as elusive desert raiders, masters of the terrain who controlled the most valuable trade routes on Earth. To outsiders, they were bandits. To those who depended on their passage, they were the unseen rulers of the desert. These were the Nabataeans, a nomadic people whose origins remained shrouded in mystery. Emerging from the harsh landscapes of northern Arabia, they mastered survival in one of the most unforgiving environments known to antiquity. Unlike conventional raiders, the Nabataeans wielded knowledge as their greatest weapon. They controlled hidden water sources, engineered subterranean cisterns, and carved channels into rock to capture and store rainfall. These innovations transformed the desert into a controlled domain, allowing them to determine who could traverse its vast expanse and who would perish beneath its scorching sun. To merchants unfamiliar with the terrain, safe passage depended entirely on Nabataean consent, often secured through tribute, alliances, or negotiated protection. By the 2nd century BCE, the Nabataeans had evolved from elusive raiders into powerful intermediaries of international trade. They dominated the incense route, the ancient artery that carried aromatic resins from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean world. Frankincense and myrrh, prized in religious rituals and medicine, commanded prices rivaling gold. Classical historians such as Diodorus Siculus describe the Nabataeans as fiercely independent, avoiding permanent settlements and striking swiftly against any force that threatened their autonomy. When the Greek general Antigonus Monophthalmus attempted to seize their wealth in 312 BCE, his expedition ended in failure. Nabataean forces ambushed the invaders, reclaimed their treasures, and vanished into the desert, leaving the would-be conqueror humiliated. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale of Nabataean sophistication. At Petra, their legendary capital carved into rose-red sandstone cliffs, an advanced network of dams, aqueducts, and reservoirs sustained a thriving urban center in the heart of the desert. These hydraulic systems allowed the Nabataeans to control water with remarkable precision, transforming Petra into a secure hub of commerce and diplomacy. Caravans from Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia converged there, exchanging goods under Nabataean supervision. Far from being mere raiders, they imposed tariffs, regulated trade, and maintained a monopoly over one of antiquity's most lucrative economic corridors. Despite their prosperity, the Nabataeans left relatively few written records of their own, and much of their history survives through the accounts of foreign observers. Greek and Roman writers often portrayed them as cunning desert bandits, yet their architectural achievements and extensive trade networks suggest a highly organized society governed by strategic vision rather than lawless ambition. Over time, their influence expanded into a recognized kingdom, forging diplomatic ties with powerful neighbors while preserving their autonomy. In 106 CE, the Roman Empire annexed Nabataea as the province of Arabia Petraea, integrating its trade routes into imperial infrastructure. Officially, their independence ended. Unofficially, their legacy endured in the arteries of commerce they had forged across the desert. Following the Roman annexation, Petra's prominence gradually declined as maritime trade routes eclipsed overland caravans. The once vibrant city faded into obscurity, its monuments buried beneath shifting sands and forgotten by the outside world. For centuries, the Nabataeans were remembered only through fragmentary texts and scattered ruins. When Petra was rediscovered in 1812 by the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, its grandeur astonished the modern world, revealing a civilization whose ingenuity had been obscured by time and history's silence. If the Nabataeans began as raiders who controlled the desert through secrecy and survival, their transformation into masters of trade challenges the boundaries between outlaw and sovereign. They governed not through conquest alone, but through knowledge, infrastructure, and economic dominion. In the silent expanse of the Arabian sands, they forged an empire without walls, one that rose from the shadows of banditry to command the wealth of nations. The Bedouin caravan raiders. In the early centuries of the first millennium CE, as the sun rose over the vast Arabian peninsula, caravans laden with silk, spices, incense, and gold wound their way across the barren expanse of sand and stone. These journeys were perilous, stretching for hundreds of miles through unforgiving terrain, where a single miscalculation could mean death by thirst or exposure. Yet merchants feared not only the desert itself, but the unseen riders who watched from distant dunes. At dusk, shadows would stir along the horizon. Swift horsemen, wrapped in flowing robes and guided by the stars, descended upon the caravans with sudden precision. The encounters were swift, calculated, and often bloodless. Goods were seized, tribute demanded, and then, as silently as they had appeared, the raiders vanished into the night. To the merchants of antiquity, these were not random acts of banditry, but a system, an unspoken authority enforced by the Bedouin tribes who controlled the arteries of desert commerce. The Bedouins, nomadic inhabitants of the Arabian deserts, lived according to a code of survival shaped by centuries of hardship. Mastery of navigation, knowledge of hidden wells, and an intimate understanding of the shifting sands granted them unparalleled control over the peninsula's interior. Unlike conventional bandits, Bedouin raiders operated within a structured social and economic framework. Their raids, known as gahazu, were not merely acts of plunder, but culturally sanctioned expeditions designed to assert dominance, acquire resources, and maintain tribal prestige. Violence was often restrained, and caravans that agreed to pay tribute or secure Bedouin protection were allowed safe passage across the desert. In this way, the Bedouins functioned simultaneously as predators and guardians, enforcing a system of protection that governed trade routes long before the rise of centralized states. Historical records from Byzantine, Persian, and early Islamic sources reveal the extent of Bedouin influence over regional commerce. Caravans traveling between Yemen, Syria, and Mesopotamia depended on Bedouin guides to navigate treacherous landscapes and avoid hostile encounters. The tribe's knowledge of the desert transformed them into indispensable intermediaries, capable of determining the success or failure of long-distance trade. Inscriptions and historical accounts describe treaties forged between Bedouin leaders and imperial authorities, granting subsidies or privileges in exchange for safe passage through tribal territories. These agreements, often negotiated under the threat of disruption, demonstrate the Bedouins' ability to wield power equal to that of established empires. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts, revealing ancient caravan routes marked by desert fortresses, wells, and rest stations strategically positioned across the Arabian Peninsula. Many of these installations were maintained or influenced by Bedouin tribes, whose presence ensured both security and control. Even after the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE, Bedouin clans continued to play a critical role in shaping the political and economic landscape of the region. Their allegiance determined the stability of trade networks, and their mobility allowed them to operate beyond the reach of conventional authority. To imperial powers, they were unpredictable raiders. To merchants and rulers alike, they were indispensable allies. Despite their prominence, the Bedouins left few written records of their own, and their history survives primarily through oral traditions and the writings of foreign observers. These accounts often portray them as lawless nomads, yet such depictions obscure the complexity of their social structure and the strategic sophistication of their operations. The Bedouin code of honor, governed by customs of hospitality, loyalty, and retribution, created a balance between conflict and cooperation that sustained desert life for centuries. Their authority was not imposed through fortresses or armies, but through reputation, mobility, and an intimate knowledge of the land. As maritime trade routes gradually supplanted overland caravans, the Bedouins' influence over commerce diminished, yet their legacy endured. The ancient caravan trails they once controlled remain etched into the geography of the Middle East, silent reminders of a time when the desert itself was governed by those who understood it best. Their role as both raiders and protectors shaped the evolution of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange across one of the world's most inhospitable regions. If the Bedouin tribes could dictate the movement of caravans, negotiate with empires, and command tribute across vast deserts without constructing cities or monuments, then their authority transcended the label of banditry. They were not merely raiders of the sands, but custodians of the desert's invisible highways. sovereigns of a realm defined not by borders, but by knowledge, honor, and survival. The Illyrian pirate queen Teuta. In 230 BCE, Roman merchants sailing along the Adriatic Sea began to vanish without warning. Cargo vessels bound for the Italian peninsula disappeared between the rugged coastlines of Illyria and the Greek colonies of Epirus. Survivors who reached Roman harbors spoke of swift warships emerging from hidden coves, their sails dark against the horizon, their prows cutting silently through the water. These ships bore the insignia of Queen Teuta, ruler of the Nabataean kingdom, whose dominion stretched along the eastern Adriatic. What Rome dismissed as piracy soon revealed itself to be something far more troubling, a sovereign power enforcing its authority upon the sea. When Roman envoys were dispatched to demand an end to the attacks, one was murdered upon leaving Teuta's court. The message was unmistakable. The Adriatic was no longer under Roman protection. Queen Teuta rose to power following the death of her husband, King Agron, around 231 BCE. Acting as regent for her young stepson Pin, she inherited a maritime kingdom whose strength lay in its formidable fleet. Unlike conventional pirates, the Illyrians operated under royal sanction. Their swift, maneuverable vessels, known as lembi, were designed for speed and surprise, capable of navigating the narrow inlets and rocky coves that dotted the Illyrian coastline. From these natural strongholds, Illyrian sailors launched coordinated raids on merchant convoys, intercepting ships laden with grain, timber, and precious metals. Greek and Roman sources describe their tactics as precise and relentless, striking at dawn or dusk before vanishing into the labyrinth of the Adriatic's islands and peninsulas. Archaeological discoveries along the Dalmatian coast support these accounts. Remnants of fortified harbors, watchtowers, and naval installations suggest a structured maritime network rather than disorganized piracy. Under Teuta's rule, Illyrian fleets extended their reach southward, capturing key coastal cities such as Phoenice and Epirus, and threatening the vital trade routes that connected Greece and Italy. Classical historians, including Polybius and Appian, recorded that Greek merchants were forced to pay tribute for safe passage, effectively acknowledging Illyrian dominance over the Adriatic. What Rome perceived as lawlessness was, in reality, a system of economic control enforced by a sovereign authority. The situation escalated when Roman ambassadors confronted Teuta in 229 BCE, demanding an end to Illyrian raids. According to historical accounts, Teuta replied that while she could restrain her officials, it was not the custom of Illyrian rulers to interfere with the private ventures of their subjects. Shortly thereafter, one of the envoys was assassinated, allegedly by Illyrian agents. The incident provided Rome with the justification it needed. The Roman Republic declared war, launching the First Illyrian War, the first naval conflict in its history beyond the Italian peninsula. Roman forces, under the command of consuls Gnaeus, Fulvius Centumulus, and Lucius Postumius Albinus, advanced across the Adriatic with unprecedented speed. Within months, key Illyrian strongholds fell to Roman control. Teuta retreated to the fortified city of Rhizon, where she was ultimately compelled to surrender in 227 BCE. The terms of peace stripped her of most of her territory, limited her naval power, and prohibited Illyrian ships from sailing south of Lissus without Roman permission. Officially, the Illyrian threat was extinguished. Unofficially, the conflict marked Rome's emergence as a dominant naval power in the Adriatic. Despite her defeat, Queen Teuta's legacy endures as one of the most formidable figures of antiquity. To Roman historians, she was a pirate queen whose defiance threatened the stability of Mediterranean commerce. To her own people, she was a sovereign ruler defending the traditions and autonomy of Illyria. The line between piracy and statecraft, between outlaw and monarch, blurred beneath her command. Her reign demonstrated that control of maritime trade could rival the authority of empires, compelling Rome to project its power beyond its traditional borders. Today, the ruins of Illyrian fortresses and harbors remain scattered along the Adriatic coast, silent witnesses to a time when the sea was governed not by imperial decree, but by a queen who ruled through speed, strategy, and defiance. Her story survives in fragments of ancient texts and weathered stone, a testament to a sovereign whose authority challenged the might of Rome itself. If Queen Teuta's fleets could dominate the Adriatic, disrupt international trade, and provoke the Roman Republic into its first overseas war, then her rule transcends the label of piracy. She was not merely a raider of merchant ships, but the architect of a maritime power that forced an empire to reckon with a queen. The Indo-Scythian Warlords. In the late 2nd century BCE, rumors spread along the trade routes of Central Asia of a new power advancing from the northern steppes. Caravans traveling through the Oxus Valley began arriving late, or not at all. Fortified towns along the fringes of Bactria reported raids by mounted warriors clad in scale armor, their banners unfamiliar, their tactics swift and unforgiving. Greek chroniclers describe them as nomadic invaders from beyond the horizon, appearing without warning and vanishing into the vast grasslands. These warriors were the Indo-Scythians, steppe-born rulers who carved their dominion across Central Asia and northern India, controlling the arteries of trade that connected east and west. To the settled kingdoms they displaced, they were marauders. To the lands they governed, they became kings. The Indo-Scythians, known in Indian sources as the Sakas, emerged from the migratory upheavals of the Eurasian steppe. Pressured westward and southward by rival nomadic confederations, they advanced into the remnants of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and beyond the Hindu Kush. Their arrival marked the collapse of Hellenistic rule in parts of Central Asia and initiated a transformation of the region's political landscape. Mounted on resilient steppe horses and armed with powerful composite bows, Indo-Scythian warriors employed tactics perfected over centuries of nomadic warfare. They struck swiftly, overwhelmed fortified settlements, and secured control over strategic corridors linking the Silk Road with the Indian subcontinent. Archaeological and numismatic evidence reveals the scale of their influence. Coins bearing the names of Indo-Scythian rulers, such as Moes and Azes, have been discovered across modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwestern India. These coins, inscribed in Greek and Kharosthi scripts, reflect a fusion of Hellenistic and Indian traditions, illustrating the Indo-Scythians' ability to integrate into and govern diverse cultures. Excavations at ancient urban centers such as Taxila have uncovered artifacts indicating sustained trade and cultural exchange under their rule. Far from being transient raiders, the Indo-Scythians established structured administrations, maintained diplomatic relations, and facilitated commerce along routes vital to the movement of silk, spices, and precious metals. Control of these trade networks granted the Indo-Scythian warlords immense economic and strategic power. Caravans traversing the Silk Road were subject to their authority, paying tribute in exchange for safe passage through territories that stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the fertile plains of the Indus Valley. Their dominion bridged civilizations, connecting the Hellenistic world with the emerging powers of India and the distant empires of China. Classical sources describe them as formidable adversaries, while Indian texts record their integration into local society, where they adopted royal titles and patronized religious institutions, including early Buddhist communities. Despite their prominence, much of the Indo-Scythian legacy remains obscured by the passage of time. Their history survives primarily through scattered inscriptions, coinage, and the accounts of foreign chroniclers, leaving many aspects of their origins and governance open to interpretation. Over time, their territories were absorbed by subsequent powers, including the Kushan Empire, whose rulers inherited and expanded the trade networks established by their predecessors. Yet the Indo-Scythians' impact endured, shaping the cultural and economic landscape of Central and South Asia for generations. Modern scholarship continues to reassess their role in antiquity, recognizing them not merely as invaders, but as architects of a trans-regional order that facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and traditions across continents. Their mobility allowed them to dominate vast territories without constructing monumental cities or fortifications, while their strategic control of trade routes enabled them to wield influence far beyond their numbers. To their adversaries, they were nomadic raiders who disrupted established kingdoms. To the regions they governed, they were sovereign rulers whose authority rested on military strength, economic control, and cultural adaptability. If the Indo-Scythian warlords could dismantle Hellenistic kingdoms, command the Silk Road, and establish dynasties that bridged civilizations, then their legacy transcends the label of banditry. They were not merely riders of the steppe, but architects of an empire without walls. sovereigns whose dominion stretched from the windswept plains of Central Asia to the thriving cities of ancient India. The Yellow Turban prophet Zhang. In 184 CE, as droughts ravaged the eastern provinces of the Han dynasty and famine gripped the countryside, rumors began to circulate among the peasantry of a healer who could command the forces of heaven. His name was Zhang, a mystic scholar from Julu, whose teachings spread quietly across northern China. Villagers whispered of miraculous cures and prophetic visions. Those who sought his aid were given sacred talismans and instructed to drink water infused with ashes from burned charms. Many claimed to recover from illness, and word of his power spread with astonishing speed. What began as a spiritual movement soon transformed into a vast network of secret followers bound by faith, loyalty, and a shared resentment toward the failing Han government. By the spring of that year, Zhang Jue and his brothers, Zhang Bao and Zhang Liang, had amassed hundreds of thousands of adherents. The stage was set for one of the most destabilizing uprisings in Chinese history. Zhang Jue proclaimed himself the General of Heaven and declared the advent of a new era under the doctrine of the Way of Great Peace, Taiping Dao. His followers, easily recognized by the yellow scarves they wore upon their heads, believed that the Han dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. In secret gatherings, they recited prophecies foretelling the fall of the empire and the rise of a just and harmonious world. Ancient chronicles describe coded messages circulated among believers, instructing them to prepare for a coordinated uprising across multiple provinces. When the rebellion erupted in 184 CE, it spread with astonishing speed, engulfing large swaths of northern China. Government granaries were seized, local officials were overthrown, and entire commanderies fell under Yellow Turban control. To imperial authorities, they were insurgents. To their followers, they were liberators chosen by heaven. Historical records from the Book of the Later Han recount how the Yellow Turban Rebellion paralyzed the empire. Imperial armies struggled to suppress the insurgents, whose numbers and organization rivaled those of the state itself. The rebels operated with remarkable coordination, employing guerrilla tactics and leveraging widespread discontent among the peasantry. Inscriptions and contemporary accounts suggest that Zhang Jue's network extended across at least 8 provinces, forming a shadow administration that challenged Han authority. Though armed primarily with agricultural tools and improvised weapons, the rebels' fervor and unity allowed them to seize strategic strongholds and disrupt vital trade routes. For months, the Han dynasty teetered on the brink of collapse. Archaeological findings and textual analyses reveal that the Yellow Turban movement was not merely a spontaneous uprising, but a structured organization rooted in religious ideology and social reform. Zhang Jue's teachings blended Taoist philosophy with millenarian prophecy, promising the restoration of cosmic balance through the overthrow of corrupt rule. Scholars have noted that the movement's hierarchical structure, complete with designated leaders and regional commanders, resembled that of a parallel government operating beyond imperial control. This fusion of faith and rebellion transformed Zhang Jue from a healer into a revolutionary figure whose authority extended across vast territories. The Han court responded with overwhelming force. Generals such as He Jin and Cao Cao were mobilized to crush the rebellion, leading to a series of brutal campaigns that eventually suppressed the insurgents. Zhang Zhuo himself died during the conflict, reportedly from illness, and his brothers were slain soon after. By the end of the year, the Yellow Turban Rebellion had been largely quelled. Official histories recorded the uprising as a calamity swiftly overcome. Yet the consequences proved far more enduring. The suppression of the rebellion weakened central authority, empowered regional warlords, and set in motion the events that would lead to the fragmentation of the Han dynasty and the emergence of the Three Kingdoms era. Despite its defeat, the legacy of Zhang Jue and the Yellow Turbans persisted in legend and historical memory. Imperial records portrayed them as rebels and heretics, yet their movement reflected the grievances of a population burdened by famine, corruption, and inequality. Their ability to mobilize hundreds of thousands of followers and control significant regions of the empire challenges the simplistic label of banditry. They governed through ideology, commanded loyalty through faith, and reshaped the political landscape of ancient China. If Zhang Jue and his Yellow Turban leaders could rally an empire's oppressed, disrupt imperial authority, and carve out territories beyond the reach of the Han court, then their power transcended that of mere insurgents. They were not simply rebels in yellow scarves, but architects of a revolutionary force that nearly toppled one of history's greatest dynasties, the Blemmyes Desert Raiders. In the late 3rd century CE, Roman outposts along the southern frontier of Egypt began reporting unsettling disturbances. Patrols stationed near the Nile's cataracts encountered abandoned watchtowers, plundered caravans, and shrines desecrated in remote desert sanctuaries. Traders traveling between Nubia and the Mediterranean vanished without a trace, their goods scattered across the sands. Survivors spoke of swift raiders emerging from the barren expanse beyond the Roman border, mounted on camels and horses, striking with calculated precision before disappearing into the uncharted deserts of Nubia. These attackers were known to the Romans as the Blemmyes, enigmatic desert warriors whose presence haunted the empire's southern frontier. To imperial authorities, they were nomadic bandits. To those who lived along the Nile, they were an independent power beyond Rome's reach. The Blemmyes inhabited the harsh territories between the eastern Sahara and the Red Sea, a region defined by unforgiving heat, jagged mountains, and vast stretches of arid wilderness. Mastery of this environment granted them unparalleled mobility and strategic advantage. Ancient Roman and Greek writers described them as elusive and formidable, capable of traversing immense distances without reliance on established roads or supply lines. Their raids targeted Roman garrisons, caravan routes, and sacred temples, including the renowned sanctuary of Isis at Philae, a site of immense religious significance. Inscriptions from the region revealed that the Blemmyes not only plundered but also occupied and controlled portions of Lower Nubia, asserting authority over key trade corridors linking Africa with the Mediterranean world. Archaeological discoveries along the Nile Valley corroborate these accounts. Fortified Roman outposts at Talmis and Primis show evidence of repeated attacks, while inscriptions and treaties preserved on temple walls document diplomatic engagements between Roman officials and Blemmian leaders. These records suggest that the Blemmyes were far more than disorganized raiders. They functioned as a tribal confederation, capable of negotiating with one of the most powerful empires in history. In the 4th and 5th centuries CE, Roman authorities entered into formal agreements with Blemmian chieftains, granting them access to grazing lands and pilgrimage rights at Philae in exchange for peace. Such treaties indicate a level of political organization and recognition that blurred the boundary between outlaw and sovereign. Classical sources, including those of Procopius and Olympiodorus, portray the Blemmyes as both feared adversaries and indispensable intermediaries in desert commerce. Their control of caravan routes across Nubia enabled them to regulate the flow of gold, ivory, incense, and exotic animals destined for Roman markets. Merchants traveling through these territories often relied on Blemmian protection, offering tribute to ensure safe passage. This system of negotiated authority allowed the Blemmyes to maintain influence over vast regions without constructing permanent cities or fortifications. Their power was rooted in mobility, environmental knowledge, and the strategic exploitation of trade networks. Despite their prominence, much of the Blemmyes' history remains obscured by fragmentary records and the biases of Roman chroniclers, who frequently depicted them as mythical or monstrous figures. Some ancient writers even described them as headless men, a legend that likely arose from misinterpretations or cultural misunderstandings. Modern scholarship, supported by archaeological evidence, has dispelled these myths, revealing a complex society capable of diplomacy, warfare, and economic control. Their disappearance from historical records in the 6th century CE coincides with shifting trade patterns and the expansion of Byzantine authority in the region, suggesting that their decline was gradual rather than abrupt. The ruins of Roman fortresses and temples along Egypt's southern frontier stand as silent witnesses to centuries of conflict and negotiation with the Blemmyes. These structures, weathered by time and desert winds, testify to an era when Rome's influence extended only as far as its legions could march, and no farther. Beyond those limits lay a domain governed not by imperial decree, but by the authority of desert tribes who understood the land better than any conqueror. If the Blemmyes could challenge Roman authority, control the arteries of trade along the Nile, and secure treaties with the empire itself, then their legacy transcends the label of banditry. They were not merely raiders of the desert frontier, but sovereign custodians of Nubia's invisible highways, rulers without walls whose dominion endured beyond the reach of Rome. The Gotland Sea Kings. In the early centuries of the first millennium CE, merchant vessels navigating the cold, mist-covered waters of the Baltic Sea began reporting encounters with unidentified fleets emerging from the northern horizon. These ships were sleek, narrow, and swift, their hulls cutting silently through the dark waters at dawn. They appeared without warning along vital trade routes linking Scandinavia, the Slavic lands, and the distant markets of Byzantium and the Islamic world. Caravans traveling by river toward the Baltic vanished, their cargo never reaching its destination. Survivors spoke of disciplined crews who seized goods with calculated efficiency, before disappearing into the labyrinth of islands scattered across the sea. At the heart of this maritime network lay the island of Gotland, a remote outpost that would become the domain of powerful merchant kings. To outsiders, they were pirates. To those who traded beneath their watch, they were the sovereigns of the Baltic. Gotland's strategic position at the center of the Baltic Sea transformed it into a crossroads of commerce long before the rise of the Viking Age. Archaeological excavations on the island have uncovered one of the largest concentrations of silver hoards ever discovered in Europe, including thousands of coins minted in the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Carolingian realm. These treasures, dating from the 6th to the 11th centuries CIE, testify to Gotland's central role in a vast trading network that connected northern Europe with the Silk Road and beyond. The accumulation of such immense wealth suggests not only prosperous commerce, but also control over the maritime corridors through which these goods flowed. The so-called Sea Kings of Gotland were not monarchs in the traditional sense, but powerful chieftains who commanded fleets of longships and merchant vessels. Their authority rested on a delicate balance between trade and predation. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence indicate that these seafarers operated as both merchants and raiders, escorting convoys across dangerous waters while imposing tribute on those who refused their protection. The island's natural harbors provided secure anchorages, while its isolation allowed fleets to launch sudden raids along the coasts of the Baltic and beyond. Runestones and sagas from later centuries recount the exploits of northern seafarers whose voyages extended along the river systems of Eastern Europe, reaching the Black Sea and the gates of Constantinople. Excavations at sites such as Visby and Spillings, the latter yielding the largest Viking-era silver hoard ever found, reveal a society enriched by international trade and maritime dominance. Artifacts recovered from these sites include Arabic dirhams, Byzantine jewelry, and finely crafted weapons, illustrating the cosmopolitan character of Gotland's economy. These discoveries suggest that the Sea Kings wielded influence not merely through force, but through their control of commerce and diplomacy. Their ships carried furs, amber, iron, and slaves across vast distances, forging connections between distant civilizations and shaping the economic landscape of medieval Europe. Despite their prominence, the Sea Kings left few written records of their own, and much of their history survives through archaeological findings and fragmentary references in Norse sagas. As maritime powers in Scandinavia expanded during the Viking Age, Gotland emerged as a vital hub within an increasingly interconnected world. The island's merchants maintained a degree of autonomy even as regional kingdoms consolidated authority, preserving their influence through alliances, trade privileges, and strategic neutrality. Over time, however, shifting political dynamics and the rise of centralized states diminished their independence, integrating Gotland into broader Scandinavian and European trade networks. Today, the windswept shores of Gotland and the medieval walls of Visby stand as enduring reminders of an era when the Baltic Sea was governed not by empires, but by those who commanded its currents. The immense wealth unearthed from the island's soil offers silent testimony to a maritime power that flourished beyond the boundaries of conventional authority. These sea kings, operating between commerce and conquest, blurred the distinction between merchant and pirate, protector and predator. If the rulers of Gotland could command fleets, regulate trade across the Baltic, and accumulate fortunes rivaling those of established kingdoms, then their legacy transcends the label of banditry. They were not merely raiders of northern waters, but architects of a maritime dominion, sovereigns without crowns, whose authority was etched into silver, stone, and the shifting tides of history. Conclusion. It crossed the vast landscapes of antiquity, from the storm-tossed waters of the Mediterranean to the silent expanse of the Arabian desert, from the wind-swept Eurasian steppes to the mist-covered Baltic Sea. History records the rise of leaders who existed beyond the boundaries of empire and law. The Cilician pirates paralyzed Rome's lifeline. Modu Chanyu compelled the Han dynasty to negotiate and fortify its borders, and the Scythian kings defied the might of Persia without building a single city. In the deserts, the Nabataeans and Bedouin tribes transformed survival into dominion, controlling the arteries of trade through knowledge and mobility. Queen Teuta's Illyrian fleets forced Rome into its first overseas war, while the Indo-Scythian warlords bridged civilizations along the Silk Road. Zhang's yellow turbans nearly toppled an empire through faith and rebellion, and the Blemmyes negotiated with Rome as equals along the Nile. In the Baltic, the Sea Kings of Gotland amassed fortunes that rivaled kingdoms, ruling through commerce and command of the sea. Each of these figures was branded a bandit, raider, or outlaw by the powers they challenged. Yet their influence extended far beyond plunder. They controlled trade routes, governed territories, negotiated treaties, and shaped the destinies of civilizations. Their authority did not arise from crowns or imperial decrees, but from mobility, strategy, and an intimate mastery of the environments they ruled. In many cases, they established systems of power that rivaled and at times surpassed those of recognized states. History, written by empires, often reduced these leaders to criminals or rebels. But archaeology, ancient chronicles, and the enduring remnants of their dominion tell a more complex story, one of alternative powers that flourished outside the structures of conventional rule. They were architects of invisible empires, sovereigns without thrones, whose legacies reshaped the political and economic landscapes of the ancient world. When those branded as outlaws could command armies, control economies, and negotiate with empires as equals, the line between bandit and ruler becomes indistinguishable. Were these ancient bandit leaders truly criminals, or were they simply kings whom history refused to recognize?